This obscure piece of gaming hardware has an interesting history. This is the Triforce arcade system, the culmination of an unlikely partnership between SEGA, Nintendo, and NAMCO. With only a few titles made for the system, its potential was never really reached, as it was meant to serve as a bridge between the home and arcade environment, with some very interesting and unique features. So, let's take a look at the Triforce and see what it's all about. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to Macho Nacho Productions. Today I have something really interesting and exciting to show you. I ran across a listing for this strange arcade system from Nintendo and Sega while browsing Syndico and was quite intrigued by it and hesitantly decided to pull the trigger and buy it. So today we'll be taking a look at it. This is the Triforce arcade system, produced as a joint effort between Nintendo, Sega, and NAMCO. There isn't too much information about this arcade system, and that's not surprising since it didn't seem to be super popular or have a lot of titles produced for it. Now perhaps the single most interesting thing about the system is that it's based on the Nintendo Gamecube's hardware, which we'll dive into a bit later in the video. Okay, so in this video I'm going to give you a brief history of the Triforce arcade system, then go over all of its hardware components, the most important being the Triforce unit itself. I'll also show you how the system operates by playing one of the games that came with the auction, and lastly, I'll discuss why this system exists, what its legacy is, and why it was short-lived, only having about 12 games made for it. So, like I stated previously, the Triforce was a collaboration between Nintendo, Sega, and NAMCO, the latter two being veterans in the arcade business. And as the name of the collaboration suggests, the Triforce is a representation of the three companies' partnership, and of course a reference to the storied Nintendo franchise, Zelda. The first game released for the system was Virtua Striker 2002, released by Sega, unsurprisingly, in the year 2002. And the last game produced was Mario Kart GP Arcade 2 in 2007. Since this was an arcade system, it made a lot of sense having Sega and Namco be a part of the venture. But how did Nintendo fit into the mix? Well, interestingly, the entire Triforce arcade system is based on the Nintendo Gamecube's hardware. This was done to reduce development costs, and it also allowed for ports of Gamecube games to be easily created for the arcade market. This partnership followed a very similar approach to another Sega arcade system called the Shihiro, which was based on the original Xbox architecture. Now, as I previously alluded to, a lot of the games produced for the platform are essentially ports of original Gamecube titles, such as the Virtua Striker franchise, as well as some Gamecube favorites, such as F-Zero AX, which is a port of F-Zero GX. So having discussed a little about the history of the Triforce, let's take a look at all the arcade system components. Starting with the more remedial components first, and working our way up to the Triforce unit itself, let's start with the power supply. This looks like any standard run-of-the-mill PSU with 4 cables extending from it, each of which powering all the various components. Looking at the label on the bottom, we can see it's a 300 watt ATX power supply. Moving on to the next component, we have the Sega JVS I/O board. This PCB is responsible for handling the controls. It plugs into the Triforce via a USB-C Type B port and gets its power from these two connectors here. The arcade controls themselves interface with the I/O board using this 40-pin IDE connector. The previous owner actually modified this Sega arcade stick originally designed for the Saturn to work with the Triforce, which is pretty neat. I am, however, planning to clean up the wiring since it seems just a little bit too janky for my liking. Next up is the GD-ROM drive. As you all may or may not know, this is the same disk media used by the Sega Dreamcast. These particular drives were also used on the Sega Naomi arcade units as well as the Shihiro. To insert a game, you need to unfasten this screw, twist, and then lift off the cover. Also interestingly, the unit has a very large fan inside to cool the assembly since the arcade cabinets tend to be left on for extended periods of time. And unfortunately, the fan is extremely loud. If anyone knows of a quieter replacement fan, let me know down below in the comments as I would love to make this system as quiet as possible. And the last and most important component to cover is the Triforce unit itself. From the outside, it's hard to tell that it's based on the Nintendo Gamecube, other than perhaps its purple color. However, the inside is a totally different story. But before taking a look under the hood, we can see here that this unit is installed with 512 megabytes of memory, as well as glean information regarding the software and firmware versions of some of the internal components. By removing the 5 exterior screws, we can gain access to the inside. Simply pivot the exterior casing and then slide it off. The first boards we see are from SEGA. The top one here appears to be for the serial port as well as the LAN port. The second larger board below appears to be the media board, which interfaces with the GD-ROM drive and is also responsible for the key chip copyright protection mechanics used by the Triforce. Here you can see the 512 megabyte stick of RAM, and I'm curious if this can be easily upgraded to 1 gigabyte since it has an extra free slot. Now, I decided not to fully assemble the unit for this video, but I definitely plan on doing so in the future. So while it may be difficult to see below the SEGA media board, if you look closely, you can make out the Gamecube motherboard. I'm planning on doing a separate video doing a full comparison between a regular Gamecube motherboard and the motherboard in the Triforce to see if there are any differences. Now over here, you can actually see the Gamecube's memory card slots. Funny enough, SEGA left on the memory card door covers, and here you can see me inserting one. From what I understand, some of the arcade titles for the Triforce actually allow you to bring your own Gamecube memory card for additional in-game functionality. Over here on the other side, you can also see the Gamecube's AV port, which isn't being utilized. However, the digital port adjacent to it seems to be connected to something. I wonder if this is where the Triforce is getting its video signal from. All in all, this is pretty fascinating, and I can't wait to fully disassemble and clean this unit. But now, let's see this thing in action. So the auction actually came with 3 games. They're all soccer games from the Virtua Striker series, which isn't too terribly exciting, and I could actually only get one of them to work, which was Virtua Striker 2002. So to get everything up and running, you first need to make sure the power supply is hooked up to all of the components. You then need to connect the Triforce to the GD-ROM drive, as well as the JVS I/O board. And lastly, you need to hook up your monitor to one of the 2 VGA ports. Once everything is hooked up, remove the GD-ROM drive cover and insert a game disc. You then need to insert the included key chip for the game into the Triforce. Each title has their own unique key chip, which appears to be some kind of copyright protection. After that, you can now switch on the power supply and the Triforce comes to life. On screen, you can see that I have some visible bars, but they seem to go away with time. I'm wondering if these artifacts are caused by the monitor that I'm using, or perhaps some components that are wearing out, such as bad leaking capacitors, which does seem unlikely given that the system isn't that old. Anyway, it takes some time for the game to initialize and load, but once it's done, we can start to play. Here on the controller, you can see that the previous owner labeled this particular switch. When I translated it using the Google Translator app, we can see that it says service button. By switching it up and down a few times, we can add credits to the game. Then press start, and you're off to the races. Another interesting note is that when powering the system on, it sounds like a jet engine. Take a listen. Since these games were likely left on for extended periods of time at the arcade, cooling becomes quite important, and I'm sure these fans are pushing through a ton of air to keep all the components cool. Unfortunately, at the expense of a lot of noise. And while Virtua Striker may not be the most exciting title, Triforce boasted more popular franchises such as F-Zero and Mario Kart. Additionally, there were a few Donkey Kong titles too. There was even a Star Fox title announced in 2002 that would be produced by NAMCO, but apparently it was scratched with only this screenshot acknowledging its existence. It would have been really neat if this title was released. So having been briefly introduced to the Triforce arcade system, can we deem it a success or a failure? And why did something like this exist? Well, to be honest, it doesn't seem that the Triforce lived up to its potential. Having only 11 unique games developed for it doesn't signal to me that it was a successful platform. When compared to the Sega Naomi, which had well over 60 games developed for it, or even the Shihiro, which had over 20 games produced for it, the Triforce just sort of seemed like an afterthought. I actually never saw these personally in the arcades where I lived, but if you played any of the Triforce games at the arcade, let me know in the comments and where you played them. It will be interesting to hear from you all how widespread these were back in the day. Now, another reason why the Triforce may have not been successful is that many of the games were ported directly from the Gamecube, or had games with similar experiences on the home console. So playing them in the arcade perhaps didn't provide a compelling or unique enough experience. So while this was an interesting blip in gaming history, I don't think the Triforce lives up to the grandeur of the Triforce name. Well, I hope you found this video interesting and learned a little bit about this fascinating partnership between Sega and Nintendo. And for those of you who want to try out some Triforce games without all this arcade equipment, you can utilize some homebrew applications for the Wii to play some of the more notable titles. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, see you all next Thursday.